I'm talking today to Charley Lewis, who was involved in a small way in the struggle against apartheid through the ANC. Charley, how did you come to get involved with the ANC?
Sure, it goes back quite a long way, Russell. I'd been teaching in schools in the Western Cape for a number of years, and before that I'd been involved through organisations like NewSAS. And
what was NewSAS?
National Union of South African Students.
Okay.
Well, I was involved in the arts side of things, so
right.
We ran sort of anti-establishment music concerts and stuff like that. And then subsequent to my studies, I went and taught in schools in the Western Cape, schools that fell under what was then referred to as the Department of Coloured Affairs, and that in a sense brought one into contact with the kind of daily deprivations, the daily hardship of apartheid, of kids living under apartheid, of kids struggling for an education.
And these were kids in townships?
These were kids in townships outside Cape Town, predominantly coloured townships given the demographics of the Western Cape. And I essentially started to look for explanations of what was going on, why people found themselves in that kind of situation, and then of course what could be done about that. I must admit, for a number of years I was rather sceptical of the ANC. We felt, or many of us, or some of us felt, that the ANC wasn't doing enough, wasn't active enough in taking up struggles in order to free the country from apartheid. I mean, this is early days I'm talking about now. So,
what sort of date?
Late 1970s,
yeah.
That kind of period. There were also in the Western Cape a number of very kind of left-wing groupings, what one might describe as kind of Trotskyite type of groupings, who ran debating societies, and that's essentially what they were. Debating societies, kind of analysing, how many contradictions can dance in the head of a pin, and I'm being perhaps a bit uncharitable to them. And got very frustrated with that situation. They felt it was really a talk shop.
Why was there no grassroots activism? Was it because the levels of repression that?
I think so, yes. It was in the years sort of post the 76 kind of generation. There was a very intense levels of repression, and there was very little at that stage active, strong kind of grassroots campaigning in South Africa. In the early 80s, I decided to go and live in Zimbabwe, which was then newly independent, which was then a very exciting place to be. Had a government that seemed to be very progressive, that looked as if they were doing a lot of the right things. And looking around for somewhere to actually do something practical, concrete, to take the struggle forward to free the country from apartheid, from oppression, from deprivation. And during the period I was there, I got into contact with people who were working through the South African Communist Party, SACP, and underwent some training in Zimbabwe, and got drawn into and essentially became a member of the South African Communist Party.
Training of what sort?
Most of the training in Zimbabwe was, some of it was kind of ideological training, reading, discussing, analysing. We did some training in sort of practical aspects of things like dead letterboxes and detection routes and that sort of thing. We were then sent off to the Soviet Union, as it then was, the Gorbachev days. Spent some months training in the Soviet Union, some of which again was ideological training, but there was also practical training.
Presumably with the KGB?
Yes, it would have been, although the people who trained us were a mixture of people. Some of them would have been KGB. We had people training us in weapons training. We did, again, detection routes, dead letter boxes, undercover operations. We did some training in propaganda work, because essentially we were going to be put back into the country as a propaganda unit. And then came back into South Africa in about 1998, so 1988, let's get the year right, the decade right. Came back in South Africa in 1988 with instructions essentially to wait for...
and how long was your training in the Soviet Union?
It was about 4 months. about 4 months that we were there.
And it was you and your...
My ex-wife,
Yeah.
the two of us together. It was a very small unit, and in fact it was deliberately done in that particular way because we hadn't been very high-profile activists. We'd been involved in the UDF at its launch, but by that time I was already living in Zimbabwe. And so we didn't have a very high profile. We were able to move in and out of the country relatively easily. I had family in the Western Cape, so I was able to travel down by train, go and visit family in the Western Cape and so on and so forth. So they kept us relatively kind of isolated because that meant that our kind of security and profile wouldn't be compromised, that we could move to a certain extent under the radar.
So how did you re-enter South Africa as the propaganda unit?
We drove across the border.
Right.
I came to the end of my 5 years in Zimbabwe, and it was a logical reason why one could come back, because I would either have had to become a citizen of Zimbabwe, my 5-year work permit had come to its end, or come back to South Africa. So it gave us a reason to come back to South Africa. And so essentially we packed up such house as we had in Harare in the back of a small minivan, drove down, spent the sort of night in Beitbridge kind of memorizing things, tearing up screeds of paper, and I think we blocked the toilet, flushing all the paper down the toilet that we couldn't take across the border, and wandered across the border or drove across the border the next morning.
Right.